I think maybe what makes sense too, is to kind of tell your audience and your viewers a little bit about how important animals are to the vitality of the forest. And I'll give you one example, which is something that I've personally learned when I was on the ground in Costa Rica in the Osa Peninsula, which is the Osa Peninsula holds 5% of the world's biodiversity, one of the most biodiverse places in the world. And there's a monkey species there called the spider monkey. It's a highly endangered, critically endangered species. So there's an organization on the ground called Osa Conservation, wonderful people. They're fighting off illegal loggers, but they're also doing everything they can to try to protect that particular species of monkey because it's so vital. And when I started learning more about it, I discovered how wonderful and how amazing that connection between a forest and a species or an animal is. If you take the spider monkey, the one that we were just talking about, so the spider monkeys are known to eat somewhere around 100 to 110 different species of fruit. And they basically, by eating and sort of dropping the seeds on the ground, they're enabling, essentially the forest to prosper and enabling new species of fruits and new trees to come up in the forest, right? The droppings that they put on the ground, for example, through, defecating or through eating and all those kind of things, it's a vital component to wild peccaries, which are basically like wild hogs, right? That it's a primary food source for peccaries. And that's the way they survive. So they're dependent on the spider monkeys dropping food, so they're eating. And then the peccaries are a primary source for pumas and jaguars, who are notoriously bad hunters, and they like to go after animals that go in herds. So imagine this like amazing relationship between all these animals and all these species and how important they are to the forest. And if any of those break or disappear, it basically breaks the entire chain. And this is why protecting biodiversity is so important, right? And especially as the whole world is talking about climate change and the rise of temperatures and so on. Biodiversity is a way to make forests more better at doing the job that they need to do. Forests are literally the best technology that we have at absorbing carbon. There's nothing else that's better at absorbing carbon from the atmosphere than forests are, than trees and soil and forests in general, right? Any man-made technology right now that absorbs carbon, anything like that, is far more expensive and far less superior than forests are. And in order to make this natural technology better, you need to preserve its biodiversity. So this relationship and how important forest is and how important biodiversity is, it's really our only fighting chance towards doing anything about climate change, right?
Okay, so this is great. I'm so glad you took this conversation here, because I want to share with folks that biodiversity has really come to the forefront as a part of the whole mitigation plan for climate change. Like, can you talk to us a little bit about COP15 and even first start with what COP15 is? We hear, all of us ordinary people hear this referred to in the news, but I'm not sure we can appreciate the magnitude of that and then the decisions that come from it. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't claim to be experts on COP, but I know a few things. But yeah, so
it stands for, first, what does it stand for?
I'm not sure. Well, we can look it up.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's some term. But yeah, so
Brittany, I'm going to have our producer look it up.
Okay.
And then she'll put it in the chat for us.
Sounds good. Yeah, so COP15 or primarily mostly all the COPs. So you may have heard of COP26 or COP27 or COP15, those kind of things. But COP15 or any COP usually are primarily where governmental bodies come together and try to affect some sort of a policy change, right? The work that we do, the work that lots of nonprofit organizations on the ground do, they are pretty much, they're very localized, and we try as much as we can to prevent the issue in sort of an immediate way, right? But policies are important to be able to affect change globally or to be able to make governments sort of mandate a change to happen, which is really important. So one of the primary outcomes of COP15 that we're really excited about was that they really hammered down on how important biodiversity is and how important it is to create ways by which governments could fund and make commitments. They made lots of commitments to improve biodiversity and being able to put it at the sort of forefront of the fight against climate change. So I think COP15 was an important step in sort of being able to put something that normally hasn't been talked about a lot, being able to put it in the forefront of the fight against climate change. And that's what primarily COP15 was for.
So just to make sure I've got this right, when we talk about biodiversity and we talk about climate change mitigation, what we're doing is, from your explanation of how it's a great chain, and if one link breaks, the whole system is broken. If we think about biodiversity in that way, what we're doing is, biodiversity makes sure there are enough plants, there are enough animals, that all the parts of the chain are there. There are enough trees, seeds being dropped here and there to keep the new ones growing when the old ones die, blah, blah, blah. So really, if we focus on biodiversity as a major part of climate change mitigation, what we're doing is we're probably fixing a million other problems that come
That's right.
beneath it, right?
Yeah, totally. So, as I mentioned earlier, so think about, I'm sure we hear a lot about carbon, right? About carbon credit, or being carbon neutral, or reducing your carbon footprints and all those kind of things, right? Now, usually you can reduce your carbon footprints, but you can never make it zero. You're always going to produce some level of carbon emission by just you doing the basic things, right? Now, if you take that to massive companies and big organizations, they have some sort of a carbon footprint. So oftentimes what they do is they offset that carbon using a mechanism called carbon credit, right? Where they essentially buy almost like currency, carbon credit, that is intended to protect a forest somewhere in the Amazon, for example. And by virtue of that, they offset the credit, they offset the emissions that they're releasing every single year. And that's how sort of they become carbon neutral. Now, this whole carbon credit mechanism, or the mechanism of being able to actually sequester carbon from the atmosphere and store carbon and so on, that 95% of that is done by forests and by trees, storing carbon, and sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, right? And the ability to make these natural carbon sinks, these forests, make them more effective at the work that they do, is by maintaining their biodiversity and improving their biodiversity, right? So it's injecting them with this amazing capability at becoming better at becoming a natural carbon sink. That's why biodiversity is so important, because it's a critical component in offsetting all of our carbon emissions in the world. Because that's, there's no other way to do it at the moment. All the other ways are more expensive, less effective,